Chosen ones, the moment August began, the air thickened in ways the untrained couldn't name. The streets moved as if watched. The sky's hue shifted, not in color, but in weight, like it had been told a secret it didn't want to carry. Somewhere far beneath the earth, a mechanism older than the nations began to hum again. No chimes, no bells, no hands turning, yet every shadow seemed to stretch toward a single, invisible hour. You might think deadlines are made by people, stamped on paper, marked in ink. But this one was older. It was whispered in an age when maps had no borders, when time wasn't measured by numbers but by events, certain, irreversible events. They called it the appointed moment. The watchers knew. Not the kind you see in towers or behind screens, but the ones who never blink. The ones whose gaze can bend a path before your foot meets the ground. They'd been tracing you, not just your movements, but your patterns. How you breathe in the cold, how you pause before crossing certain thresholds, how your dreams replay moments you've never lived. There are places they've marked on maps that don't officially exist, holes in the earth that drink light, wells that whisper back in voices not your own. And one of them, they say, just woke up. In the stillness of the early morning, a man in a gray coat stood at a corner where no roads met, unfolding a paper the wind refused to touch. His lips moved, not in speech, but in rhythm, keeping time with something you couldn't hear, something you shouldn't hear. The signs are already in motion, not the kind that flash or speak, but the kind that shift the air, alter the gravity in your chest, and make you wonder if you're still standing where you were a moment ago. The wall was not part of the original structure. At least, that's what the old plans claimed. Its stone was darker, rougher, as if it had been pulled from a quarry, long abandoned and set in place by hands that feared what they were sealing away. Dust clung to its edges in a way that made it seem untouched for centuries. Yet, when the torchlight grazed its surface, the marks began to show not scratches, not cracks, but deliberate carvings, arranged with the precision of someone who knew they would be found only by the one meant to see them. It was not a language in the traditional sense. The shapes flowed like rivers, then rose like mountains, each line carrying a rhythm that could be felt more than read. The one who discovered it pressed their palm against the cold surface and felt the vibration faint at first, then steady, like the beating of a heart. Hidden within those etched lines was a psalm, but not one sung in temples or written in holy books. This was older, deeper, untouched by translation, and immune to the erosion of time. The words spoke of a traveler who would arrive without warning, a figure who would carry no army, no banner yet, whose presence alone would make the walls of kingdoms tremble. They spoke of a day when the stones themselves would bear witness to the truth, and the earth would remember the steps of the one who walked before the foundation of the world. And woven between those lines, almost invisible, unless you looked with the heart, was a parallel to the Nazarene, the shepherd who entered cities not on a chariot, but on foot, whose voice turned the ears of those thought deaf, and whose touch turned the eyes of those thought blind. The air in the chamber grew heavy, and the carvings seemed to glow faintly, the light not coming from fire, but from something within the stone itself. Each word felt alive, whispering into the bones of the one who read them, and the closer they leaned, the more the sound transformed into something almost like a song. Then the hum stopped. The carvings dimmed. The wall returned to stillness. Yet the psalm was no longer just on the stone. It had been transferred, etched into the memory of the one who touched it. And somewhere deep inside, they knew it would lead them to the next place before the hour struck. The wall was not part of the original structure. At least, that's what the old plans claimed. Its stone was darker, rougher, as if it had been pulled from a quarry, long abandoned and set in place by hands that feared what they were sealing away. Dust clung to its edges in a way that made it seem untouched for centuries. Yet when the torchlight grazed its surface, the marks began to show not scratches, not cracks, but deliberate carvings arranged with the precision of someone who knew they would be found only by the one meant to see them. It was not a language in the traditional sense. The shapes flowed like rivers, then rose like mountains, each line carrying a rhythm that could be felt more than read. The one who discovered it pressed their palm against the cold surface and felt the vibration faint at first, then steady like the beating of a heart. Hidden within those etched lines was a psalm, but not one sung in temples or written in holy books. This was older, deeper, untouched by translation and immune to the erosion of time. The words spoke of a traveler who would arrive without warning, a figure who would carry no army, no banner yet, whose presence alone would make the walls of kingdoms tremble. They spoke of a day when the stones themselves would bear witness to the truth, and the earth would remember the steps of the one who walked before the foundation of the world. And woven between those lines, almost invisible, unless you looked with the heart, was a parallel to the Nazarene, the shepherd who entered cities not on a chariot, but on foot, whose voice turned the ears of those thought deaf, and whose touch turned the eyes of those thought blind. The air in the chamber grew heavy, and the carvings seemed to glow faintly, the light not coming from fire, but from something within the stone itself. Each word felt alive, whispering into the bones of the one who read them. And the closer they leaned, the more the sound transformed into something almost like a song. Then the hum stopped, the carvings dimmed, the wall returned to stillness. Yet the psalm was no longer just on the stone. It had been transferred, etched into the memory of the one who touched it, and somewhere deep inside they knew it would lead them to the next place before the hour struck. It came on a morning when the sky was the color of unpolished steel, and the wind carried the scent of rain that would never fall. The envelope was resting on the windowsill, though the window had been locked all night. There was no return address, no postmark, no sign of handling. Yet the paper was warm, as if it had been carried close to a beating heart. The handwriting on the front was sharp, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who understood the weight of each stroke. Inside the paper was not ordinary. It had the texture of something both delicate and indestructible, like silk woven with metal fibers. The ink shimmered faintly, shifting colors depending on the angle of light. The letter began without greeting and without introduction, moving straight into sentences that seemed to answer questions never spoken aloud. It spoke of places the recipient had dreamed of, but never visited. Roads that curved into fog and rivers that ran backward beneath the earth. It spoke of a deadline that could not be altered, a point in time fixed before the first clock ever ticked. There were instructions written in an order that made no immediate sense. Step 7 appeared before Step 1. Step 3 was missing entirely, and Step 5 was nothing more than a single word, breathe. Each phrase was as much a riddle as it was a command. Some lines were written upside down, others in a mirror's reflection, but all of them carried the same strange pulse, as if the ink itself was alive. Midway through the letter, a section had been burned away, leaving a perfect oval of absence. The edges of the burn were cold, no ash, no scent, as if the fire that made it was not of this world. Yet, from that absence came a faint hum, a vibration that ran through the fingertips holding the page. It was not threatening, but it demanded attention. The final lines were written so small they could barely be read without leaning close. They warned that the map, the wall, and the letter were not separate clues, but pieces of the same living thread. A thread already pulling tighter with each passing moment. And as the reader lowered the page, they realized the room was not as empty as when they began. The compass was an heirloom, passed down through hands that never truly understood why it was kept. Its brass casing was tarnished, its glass scratched, but the needle always moved with a strange hesitation, as though it questioned its own direction. On most days, it pointed true enough to be trusted. Yet, when the verse was spoken aloud, it trembled, then turned away from north, as if drawn by something older than the poles. The verse had been found, scribbled on the margin of an ancient ledger. Its ink faded almost to nothing. It was only a single sentence, but the words carried the weight of centuries. When read aloud, the air seemed to shift, and the ground beneath the feet felt less certain. It spoke of a path that could not be found by seeking, and a gate that would open only to one who walked without sight. It echoed the way the Nazarene spoke in parables, confounding those who sought logic and revealing truth only to those whose hearts were ready. When the verse was recited in full, the compass spun slowly, counterclockwise, before stopping at an angle no map could account for. The more it was repeated, the stronger the pull, until it became impossible to walk any way but where it demanded. The direction it gave led not to roads or familiar landmarks, but to stretches of land where the wind carried no scent, and the shadows seemed too sharp for the light that cast them. Following, it felt less like travel and more like being drawn into a current. The landscape shifted subtly hills where there should have been plains, ruins that no history recorded, and stones carved with symbols that felt like a continuation of the psalm on the forgotten wall. The further they went, the more the needle shook, as though nearing the source of its unrest. Finally, it stopped, entirely pointing at a single blackened tree, standing alone in a field of pale grass. Its bark was carved in spirals that drew the eyes inward until the rest of the world faded. And there, between the spirals, was the same verse etched deep into the wood. But here it was incomplete, ending with a word half-formed, as if waiting for the one who had come to speak it aloud. He stood with his back to the wind, his coat heavy with dust from roads that no longer existed. His posture was neither tense nor relaxed, but fixed as if he had been carved into that spot long before anyone thought to look for him. The field behind him swayed in the slow, unnatural patterns, the grass bending in response to something unseen rather than the breeze. His eyes never moved from the horizon yet. It was clear he was aware of every step taken toward him. The air between them was thick, carrying the faint scent of smoke, though no fire was near. Each step closer seemed to stretch the distance, instead of close. It as if the ground itself wanted to prolong the meeting. When the final few paces were closed, He finally turned his head. His face was weathered, not in the way of age, but in the way of one who had stood too long between two worlds. His gaze carried the weight of someone who knew the outcome, yet still played his part. He spoke without greeting and without name. His voice was low, almost drowned by the rustle of the field, yet each word was clear. He said, the map had already shifted, that the wall's psalm had awoken, and the letter was never meant to be opened before the verse was found. He spoke as if these were not events, but stages of a single unfolding act. There was no question of how he knew. He did not explain how he had been waiting or for how long, only that the one standing before him was late, not by hours or days, but by moments that could not be regained. He warned that the next place would not appear on any path visible to the eye, that the ground would open only when the air grew still enough for the earth to hear the heart. Before turning back to the horizon, he pressed something small into their hand. It was a fragment of glass, clouded yet warm to the touch, and when held to the light, it revealed faint shifting images of places not yet seen. As the figure began to fade into the shimmer of heat rising from the grass, his final words lingered. They were already watching from the other side. The wind came without warning, a wall of sand and ash rising from the horizon, swallowing the light until the sky turned the color of burnt copper. The air thickened with a static charge that clung to skin and hair, and each breath felt stolen from someone else's lungs. The ground trembled underfoot, not with the force of an earthquake, but with the pulse of something moving beneath it. The storm's center was ahead, though the edges already clawed at everything in its path. Through the shifting haze, shapes appeared and disappeared like mirages, twisting into forms that almost looked human before being torn apart by the wind. In the heart of the storm, a darker shadow began to take shape, not made of dust but revealed through it. Two intersecting beams stood fixed against the chaos, a cross of weathered wood untouched by the tearing winds. The sand swirled around it in a perfect circle, never touching the base, as though it was shielded by something unseen. Approaching it was like walking against a tide. Each step forward pushed the body back, and the air roared in the ears. Yet beneath the noise there was another sound, faint but steady, like a voice carried from an immeasurable distance. It was not loud enough to be words yet. The cadence was unmistakable. The sound carried the same quiet authority as the one who had once calmed the sea with a single command. The same presence that could make a crowd fall silent without raising a hand. The closer they came, the more the storm seemed to weaken, not in its rage, but in its purpose. The winds curved away, the dust thinned, and the light began to bleed back into the sky. Around the cross, the air was warm, the ground firm, as though the chaos outside could not pass the boundary set here. On the wood, faint carvings could be seen, symbols intertwined with letters that formed no language, yet carried meaning deep in the chest. When a hand reached out to touch it, the wind outside roared louder, as if sensing the intrusion, and the ground vibrated with the strain of holding back the storm. The voice grew clearer still, distant yet urgent. And as the first fingertip met the grain of the wood, the storm outside shifted direction, pulling towards something unseen beyond the horizon. The building was older than the city that surrounded it, its walls swallowed by vines that clung like veins carrying something deeper than sap. The doors were heavy, carved from a single slab of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside, the air was thick, not with dust, but with the weight of years pressing down. Every surface carried a faint sheen of moisture, and somewhere far off, the sound of dripping echoed slow and deliberate, as if each drop was marking the passing of a century. Rows of shelves stretched far beyond the limits of the walls, bending in impossible directions, like corridors folding in on themselves. The books were bound in materials that did not feel like leather or cloth, and their titles shifted when looked at directly. Some tomes pulsed faintly in the dim light. Others exhaled a faint mist when opened. The drip continued steady from an unseen source, and each time it landed somewhere deeper in the archive, the floor seemed to tremble. Following the sound led to a chamber without shelves where a single pedestal stood at its center. Upon it rested a jar made of glass, so clear it was almost invisible. Inside the jar, a thick, golden liquid swirled on its own, forming shapes that dissolved before they could be recognized. The drops were falling from the jar itself, though the surface remained unbroken. Each drop that struck the floor sank instantly, leaving no mark yet, carrying with it the sensation of a memory being erased somewhere else in the world. Closer inspection revealed carvings on the pedestal. Not words, but spirals intersecting at strange angles. As the liquid swirled, it began to mimic those shapes, as though the jar was speaking in a language of motion. The sensation in the air was heavy enough to bend posture, and each breath taken here seemed to pull fragments of other lives into the lungs. The further one stared, the more the shapes began to align into something almost readable. Then the drip stopped. The liquid stilled, and for the first time, silence filled the chamber. A faint vibration ran through the floor, and a shadow passed along the wall, not cast by any figure in the room. The jar trembled once, then began to swirl again, this time forming a single unbroken shape, pointing toward the farthest corridor where the shelves leaned inward like watchers. The seal was set into the ground at the center of an open courtyard, its surface flush with the stone around it and nearly invisible, unless the light struck it from the right angle. It was made of metal, so dark it reflected nothing, and its edges were marked by lines that did not match any known script. The courtyard itself was silent, too silent for a place open to the air. No birds, no wind, no shifting of leaves, only the slow sinking of the sun toward the horizon, casting shadows that seemed to stretch toward the seal like fingers reaching for something forbidden. As the final rays began to align with the pattern, the metal warmed beneath the touch, though no heat came from the air. Around the edges, a faint light bled out, pale and cold, more like moonlight than the gold of the setting sun. Symbols began to rise from the surface, their shapes bending in ways that made the eyes ache to follow. Among them, one stood out, a design in the form of a broken circle, intersected by a single line. It carried the weight of old covenants and the quiet reminder of the Nazarene's words about what is bound on earth and in heaven. The light grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the slow beat of a heart that was not the one standing over it. The sound of stone shifting came from deep below, and cracks began to appear along the metal surface. Not sharp and jagged, but deliberate, like the slow peeling away of something that had been sealed by will rather than force. Each pulse of light widened them until a single breath of air rose from the opening, carrying with it the scent of places untouched by centuries. the ground trembled once more, and the seal gave way entirely, splitting in perfect symmetry. The space beneath was not a hole, but a descending spiral of steps vanishing into darkness. The light from above refused to follow, only the faint glow from the broken seal, lingering on the edges of the first few steps. Somewhere far below, a faint echo moved upward. Not words, not music, but the suggestion of both. The last of the sun's light slipped away, leaving the courtyard in shadow and the open spiral, waiting. The gate stood at the end of a road that seemed to appear only when approached. From a distance, there was nothing but open ground. Yet, with each step forward, the posts rose higher, the iron bars knitting themselves together in patterns that shifted like smoke. The metal was dark, not from rust, but from something deeper, as if it had been burned by a fire that left no ash. On either side, the land fell away into mist that moved without wind, thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever lay beyond. The gate had no lock yet. It refused to open at a push or pull. It yielded only when the hand rested on the center, where two symbols met a spiral, and a line intersecting in a way that mirrored the mark seen on the seal before sunset. The moment the skin touched it, the bars turned warm, and the sound of their movement was not metal, scraping stone, but a low, resonant hum, like a voice speaking from beneath the earth. The iron shifted apart slowly, each section sliding into the mist until the way ahead stood clear. Beyond the threshold, the air felt heavier, and the light changed, not brighter, not darker, but filtered, as though every color had been pulled slightly toward gold. The ground was a narrow trail lined with stones carved in repeating patterns, some familiar from the psalm on the wall, others entirely new. The path twisted through terrain that refused to stay constant. Grass fading into sand, then into black volcanic rock without warning. The mist followed close behind, never crossing the gate but pressing just beyond sight as though it were alive. Each step forward carried the strange sense of walking through layers of memory, places half remembered but never truly visited. In the distance, structures began to emerge, towers leaning at impossible angles and ridges that connected nothing to nothing, yet held firm in the air. The path led straight to them, offering no turns, no choices, only forward motion. Somewhere in the stillness, a sound began, faint like the first note of a song, waiting for its next breath, and it seemed to come from both the horizon and the ground beneath the feet. The closer it grew, the more the stones along the path began to vibrate, as though the trail itself was preparing for what lay at its end. The horizon had shifted again, though the path beneath the feet had not changed. The towers ahead were closer, yet the air between them shimmered like heat over stone, distorting their edges into shapes that could not hold form. The ground trembled in shallow pulses, each one arriving quicker than the last, as if counting down to something unseen. Above, the sky deepened in color, and the light seemed to bleed sideways, casting shadows that no object could claim. At the center of the space between the leaning towers stood a single figure, cloaked in fabric that moved against the wind. The shadow it cast was too long for the fading light stretching until it touched the edges of the stones leading up to it. When the figure lifted its head, the air thickened, and a silence pressed down heavy enough to still the heartbeat for a moment. The face was half hidden, yet the eyes burned with a steady recognition, not of the person before them, but of the role they carried, the way one might recognize a page from a prophecy finally turned. In its hands was an hourglass of blackened glass, the sand inside falling not downward, but upward, grains vanishing into the top as though time itself was retreating. The hum that had followed since the gate began to deepen, carrying the tone of a voice that spoke without words, echoing the way the Nazarene's presence once stilled storms and sent the unseen scattering. The figure tilted the hourglass slowly, and the grains froze mid-fall, hanging suspended between the two chambers. Shadows began to gather around the stones, not cast by sun or moon, but pulling themselves from the edges of the air. They curled and twisted, merging into a single form that rose like a wave behind the figure, waiting unmoving, as if held in place by the stillness of the hourglass. The ground beneath the feet of the traveler shifted subtly, no longer solid but layered with something like water reflecting a sky that was not above. The figure lowered the hourglass to the ground and stepped aside, leaving the space open and the shadow behind it shivering as if it were breathing. The final grain of sand pulsed with light before vanishing, and in the pause that followed, the air itself seemed to lean forward, waiting.